So we started last week this series on the 400 years between when the Old Testament ends and the New Testament begins. So the end of the prophet Malachi, but before the Gospel of Matthew starts. And in the Protestant world, we call this the 400 years of silence, because it looks as if almost as if God has stopped talking to his people. Because there's no new prophet raised up. There's nothing else that's really going on. Now, what we saw last week was that there's actually a lot of things that are going on, a lot of things that are happening in that time, but there is a lot of struggle that's taking place. And so we're taking a look at these 400 years, and we're going to go into all of the history of that, but we're following three different groups of people that are formed and shaped by that time, and who begin to come out, and then who, in Jesus' time, are proving formative to Jesus, his ministry, and to his followers. And so we're looking at the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and a group of folks that many of you probably have never heard of, but are just as instrumental in helping in that process called the Essenes. Now this morning, though, we are coming in with the Sadducees. We started with the Pharisees last week. They were, contrary to what we see in the Gospels and in the book of Acts, the Pharisees were not all bad people. By the time we get to the New Testament, yes, there were a lot of corrupt Pharisees, but they started well. They played an important role in the life of the Jewish people. And we remember the best example of them in Jesus' time was Nicodemus. Nicodemus, who came to Jesus under cover of night, named him his teacher so that he could learn from him. The thing that we can take from the Pharisees was that resilient faith that they had, that they learned and that they grew over time, and that they were continuing to learn and grow over time. It didn't stop with them. They had their bumps along the way, and Jesus called them out on that, but their example is very important for us. The Sadducees, on the other hand, well, let me start with this. What do you all know about the Sadducees? Anyone know anything about the Sadducees? I'm getting a lot of head shaking, no, perplexed looks. That is exactly what I expected. The Sadducees, we don't know a whole lot about them from the Bible. Like, we don't hear a lot about them. They're always put in context with, like, the Pharisees or the other religious leaders that they would come across. But by Jesus' time, they are the priestly class. They are centered on the temple. They are centered in Jerusalem. They are more aligned with the Romans, with the secular powers of the world at that time, and that's where they find themselves. But they come out of a very practical place. They come from a very needed place. Go back, and I know this was probably hard to see last Sunday because it's relatively kind of small print and it was up on the screen. One of the joys of being down here is, like, y'all are this close to me. So Haven is like getting full on preacher this morning. Come stand here and do this in front of Richard for a while. But we had this timeline of when everything is taking place, and in that 400 years, all of the different people that had control over the area of Israel in there. And the one we're concerned about for the Sadducees is that Maccabean revolt. This was when the Sadducees really got going. It started with one family. At this time, you can look on there and you can see that the Syrians had control over Jerusalem and over what we would think of as Judah at the time. And they were, most of the time, the governing powers were pretty well content to let folks do what they were going to do. But every once in a while, someone would get a little bit of a bug, and they would come in, and the Syrians came in to Israel, to Judah, to Jerusalem, and they said, "We don't like what you're doing. We want you to offer heathen sacrifices. We want you to perform pagan rituals. We want you to do all these things." And then they proceeded to do that in the temple and all of the high and holy places of the Jewish faith. And at one point, the Maccabees, this family, said, "No, we're not going to put up with this anymore." And it started with one family. They started a revolt that's going to become known as the Maccabean Revolt that will ultimately throw the Syrians out of Jerusalem so that they can regain control of Jerusalem and the surrounding areas. And they establish what's called the Hasmonean dynasty, because they're from the family of Hasmos. And so they start this Hasmonean dynasty that reigns for quite a while in Jerusalem. In that 400 years, this is the only time where they were governing themselves. And it started because these folks said, no, we're not going to continue to put up with what you are doing to us. Our faith is more important than that, and we are going to take charge of our lives and of our faith again. That was how they got there. But they're going to come in conflict with the Pharisees, primarily because the Pharisees were more strict with their faith. They were more legalistic. They were more very much following the law and the prophets, and then they developed this tradition called the Midrash, as they were working out contemporary issues through the lens of their faith. And the Pharisees struggled with the Sadducees because the Sadducees weren't from the line of David. And they said, well, God said a king is always from the line of David is always going to reign over here, so they didn't like that. They didn't like that by Jesus' time, the Sadducees had taken on a lot of the priestly roles also. And they say, well, we're getting a little bit of overlap here. We're not okay with this. And the Sadducees began to really align themselves more and more with the Romans. Not that they ever fell into that Roman faith, the polytheistic faith of the Romans, but definitely aligning themselves more closely with that. Think of the Sadducees in this way. We've got a couple of sillier examples and one not as silly example to think of them. The Sadducees can look good. They can look really good at different points in time. But they're incredibly fragile in terms of who they are, how they operate, the things that they do. They'd be a lot like the Titanic, the unsinkable ship that sank. Or more recently, and more amusing of an example is, anyone remember when Elon Musk was talking about the Cybertruck that he put together? The answer to, a couple of folks going, oh, I know where this is going already. He rolls this big contraption that has this really modern look. It looks like a stainless, looks like a DeLorean became a truck, is what it kind of looks like. He rolls it out on stage, and they're talking about how strong this truck is going to be, and that the glass on this is so strong. And in fact, they show one example where they drop this metal ball onto it, and the glass holds up to it. And then he says, watch this, and throws a big metal ball at the window of this truck. Wasn't supposed to break. You remember that scene in Aladdin where the shopkeeper goes, it does all these things, and it won't ever break. Crash, crash, boom, it broke. That's what happened. It broke on live TV. This was the Sadducees. They were built a lot like this. They were built to be strong and to solve problems, and they were built not to break. They were built to rule up until the time that things broke. Now, they would do some things very well. Where they succeeded the most was that they were the respectable side of things. How many of those powers, those folks that came in to rule during all these times, and in fact, a lot of the big empires from back in this time, when they were at their height and they were their most successful, they did that by basically coming in and saying, so long as you pay your taxes, here are the laws we want you to follow. And basically, after that, you can govern yourselves. We're okay with this. The Sadducees were the ones that were in charge. They were the primary folks that were on what was called the Sanhedrin, the Jewish ruling council. They did that. They were the respectable side of the Jewish faith as far as the Romans were concerned. They were the ones that they interacted with the most. They were the ones who were in charge, and they were the ones who were governing. But this would also be their downfall. Over time, they would become, for them, it would become more about holding on to that power. They would become more and more like that Roman culture, or more, even more so, more like Greek culture. Remember, when Alexander built his empire, even though him in charge and his empire didn't last all that long, the thing that stayed the most was Greek culture and philosophy that was shaping the world, even at the time of the Romans, and still in many ways is shaping our world today. And all of that was coming in, And they were blurring those lines between government and faith, and they were the ones that the Romans worked with, but their power had limits, and they forgot that. Go back to those examples of the Titanic or the Cybertruck, or another, this is a more silly example, but one of my favorite examples that works with, anyone like to cook with cast iron? Right? It's a few of you. You know the joys of cooking with cast iron. I have my pan seasoned well enough that I can fry an egg on there and it doesn't stick. I can do anything I want in my cast iron. I even have Emily convinced to use my cast iron pans. And they're wonderful, and they're great, and they are very strong, and they're very durable. In fact, they can be handed down from one generation to the next with a little bit of care and maintenance. The problem is, they require a lot of work. And if you do something to the seasoning on it, you've got to re-season them, and you have to keep them oiled, because if you don't, they will rust, and you got to take care of the rust, and they're very fragile. You can take a cast iron pan and you can break it very easily. If you get it too hot, you actually can crack it. They're very strong, but they're very fragile. That's the Sadducees in a nutshell. Strong, but fragile. And in Acts 4, we're going to see this come out. Much like in the Gospels, when we see the Pharisees, we see this of the Sadducees too, and especially at this point in Jewish history, they are very much corrupt. They are very much holding on to power for power's sake. And so Peter and John come into this story because they had the temerity to heal a man who was born crippled on the Sabbath. Now there's a long tradition at this point that you can do those kinds of things on the Sabbath and it's fine. Despite what everyone had said, despite all the times Jesus would do it and folks would get upset with him about doing this, those were the folks that were generally already corrupt. They didn't like anyone showing them up. It was okay to do. There was a long tradition saying this is fine, this is not a bad thing to do this. It was all about the power of the rulers, and it made them look bad. So, that ruling council, the Sadducees, they decided, no, we don't like what they're doing. You healed on the Sabbath, and that is technically wrong, even though it's not really. And so they threw them in jail. They said, we're going to throw you in jail. We're going to do this. And they let them stew overnight in jail because they thought that was going to do something. And they bring them out the next day, and they bring them up in front of this council. And it's almost like my grandmother, you've heard me say this, my grandmother taught fourth grade for like 26 years. You know that finger wag? Grandma didn't like to do that because she always said, look back at how many are pointing back at you. But we always had that teacher that had that good finger wag and say, here's this ruling council looking at these two guys, looking at them. What do you all have to say for yourselves? Right? Like they're disciplining some sort of errant child. They apparently didn't know who they were talking to. Peter responds to them like he responds to the crowd in Acts chapter 2 on the day of Pentecost, with great authority and power. And Peter begins to speak, not directly to the folks who were wanting him to account for themselves, but he begins speaking as if he is the one that is in charge of this room, because Peter is not just speaking to the folks that were gathered there, but he was speaking to all the people that they're going to talk to, and they're going to tell the story of later. He's talking to them, and he begins to preach like someone with actual authority. And those Sadducees were not expecting that. And he tells them all about Jesus. We only get a part of it, of that sermon from that day. But what we can deduce is that the entirety of what was said was enough to disturb all of those ruling leaders, all of those Sadducees a great deal. In fact, we get this wonderful verse 13 in there that says, the council was caught by surprise by the confidence with which Peter and John spoke. After all, they understood that these apostles were uneducated and inexperienced. They also recognized that they had been followers of Jesus. Remember, they had a very low opinion of all of these people. Remember last week we described the different ways that rabbis could come and they could gain power and authority or gain credibility as a teacher, and described how sometimes that happens with pastors, is that you can go the route that I've gone. You can go to seminary, you can get education, you can go through the long process of doing that and having that established. And On the other side of it, though, you have some pastors who almost accidentally become pastors because they showed up to the right or the wrong fried chicken dinner and got elected as such by their church to be pastors and to lead. I've known some great pastors who started out that way. But the difference in the reaction between Nicodemus and the Sadducees is telling. Because everyone considered Jesus to be one of those guys who had the Colonel's secret recipe of 11 herbs and spices. That's who they thought he was. And Nicodemus looks at him and calls him teacher, calls him rabbi. Nicodemus, who had been educated and was very well thought of and well respected, who had gone the long route, looks at Jesus and calls him teacher. The Sadducees look at Peter and John like this and they're going, who are these guys? They're still brushing the straw bales off of their clothes from when they came out of the country. Who are these six coming in here to tell us what to do? And yet they were cowed by Peter and John. The truth is, the Sadducees had tunnel vision. They couldn't see anyone possibly ever supplanting their power and their authority. They could never conceive of anyone possibly being smarter than them. And that was their downfall. And this becomes even more evident when we get to the last revolt that's going to happen in about 66 AD. The Romans are still in charge. They kind of gone through kind of if you know anything about Roman history during this time, they had their strong moments and their not so strong moments. In a weaker moment, in about 66, Jerusalem revolted against the Romans. Now, remember, Jerusalem also sat high on a hill and it had many walls of fortifications to hold advancing armies out. And so this was a great place if you were going to try and hold out against a larger force to do so. They forgot how large the force was that they were trying to hold out against. Rome had kind of a weak moment. They made it 4 years before the Romans said, we're tired of your shenanigans that you're pulling. And they came in and they just flattened them. And remember that the Sadducees' power was centered on the temple. Their authority was centered in Jerusalem. When it fell, so did they. Because they could conceive of nothing else. And so all we have left of them are these stories and some history. We look at the Pharisees and we say, well, we don't have any Pharisees that are still around today, but their legacy continues. The resilience of their faith, the way that they taught, the traditions that they started and helped folks to work through things, that still continues today, even if we don't have folks named Pharisees now. What we saw happen with the Sadducees is a story we've heard often. It's what happened with the Titanic. We've seen it happen in countries. We've seen it happen with leaders. We've seen it happen with church leaders. We've watched careers brought to a crashing halt. We've seen families devastated. We've seen churches hurt or closed. We've seen governments that have become non-functional. And that list goes on and on and on, because when power becomes the goal, power will cause you to fail. The problem is that power is never a goal. Maintaining power is never a goal. And if it is, then it's time to stop. Because it will fail. So what do? How do we respond to that? Most important is that in this week, is we do just kind of where we started out this morning. We stop and we give thanks. Wherever we are, whatever our situation in life is, no matter what has gone on, good, bad, or somewhere in between those things, is to stop and give thanks to God. And know that God is with us. If we give thanks to God, but we don't remember that He's with us, we need to take another step back. We need to remember that He is there with us. And not be afraid to learn and grow. That's what we'll see the Pharisees through. Even though there were also many of them that were there when the temple was destroyed in 70 AD. What they did continued on. And the last thing, you've heard me say this before, but it's true, is to be humble. Be humble like Nicodemus was humble. Humility is not a punishment. Humility is not a sign of weakness. Humility is not something that you do when you know that you've done wrong and you need to be repentant for a short period of time. Humility is a spiritual practice. And it could be something just as simple, especially this week, of admitting that Aunt So-and-so's pumpkin pie really is better than mine. or their rolls are, or their turkey is, or whatever it is. If it's cranberry sauce, they can have it. Could be something just as simple as that. Or it could be something far more important. It could be coming to terms with our own lack of power and authority in many places or with many people. It could be that we just are admitting that there are some folks out there that know more than we do about something. We don't know everything that we think we know or that we need to know about something. Or sometimes it's just saying that there are folks out there that are worthy of just as much dignity and attention as I am. One of the hallmarks of where we see things begin to fall and we see conflict happen is when you see governments or people or groups beginning to dehumanize someone else. Because when we can dehumanize them and we can treat them as an other, then we don't have to give them dignity and worth. And we can react to them far differently than we otherwise would. But we see what Nicodemus did. Nicodemus looked at this backcountry rabbi and said, "Teacher, I'm ready to learn." As we go into this week, let us be a people that follows Christ's example, that follows the example of those that have gone before and whose legacy continues on, where we give thanks, we practice humility, and we continue to learn and grow. Because that is the example that has been set for us and is the example that will take us forward. And most importantly, as we give thanks, we remember that God goes with us this day and every day. Let us do all of this in Christ's name. Amen.